So the second part of this week's lesson involves using the switch. The switch is a selection structure, and it is an alternative to using a nested if-else. It is available in pretty much every single language, and it is a great structure to use if you have a variable that you need to check for different values, and you are looking for equality. Okay? That is when the switch is an ideal structure. So it's used to check one expression against different values, and it is looking for an exact match. Okay, so if you are looking for something that's greater than or less than, switch is not for you if you are looking for ranges. Okay, so it's kind of an equality testing structure. So the way you set this up is you've got switch, and then you've got a variable or an expression that you have it, looking at. And then for each case, the variable is compared to the value, and it is checking to see if the variable is equal to the value. And if it is equal, then it goes through the statements. And once it hits break, it goes out of the structure to whatever statement follows. Now, it's super important if you're dealing with a switch that you remember to put the breaks in, because once it tests the value for equality, it will turn on a little flag that says, yep, it's equal. And so from that moment on, it executes everything that is below. And without the break, it would just go to the next case and execute, then it'd go to the next one. It would just keep executing its way down the structure. So super important to put break in there. And you can have as many case values as you want. The default case is kind of a catch-all. So if none of these were equal to the variable, then it's going to go through your default code. Now you may wonder, well, what if I've got several different values that I want the same statements executed for? Not a problem. Okay, you can kind of string those along. So you can have the first value with the colon, case, which is your keyword, and the second value with the colon. Now you can have as many as you want, and they will all execute the same statements. You may think, is break required? Okay, I know it's important, but is it required? No, it's not. Your program will compile without break, but your program will not run right if you don't put break in. Is default required? No, it's optional. Okay, it is good practice to include it. In fact, if you're expecting these different values and none of them are there, you usually have an error condition. So you would probably print an error message out. Okay, so default is used for that. One thing that people do forget is the curly braces. So let's take a look. Switch itself does not have a semicolon at the end. It has an opening curly brace, and after the default and all the statements in the break that go with default, there is a closing curly brace. Another thing to take note of is that after each case value, there is a colon. Those colons are required. And then your statements that you're executing end in a semicolon. So these are all little things you have to remember. So the switch statement itself, there's nothing at the end of that. We have an opening curly and a closing curly. Then we have our case values with colons. And then we have all of our statements. So I do have some examples in here just so you can kind of get used to working with switch. The first example, what is your favorite color? We read that string in. In a switch, if you have a string that you're checking, it is a good idea to convert it to lowercase. That way you don't have to have as many case statements. Okay, so unless, upper and lowercase matter, which in this case for a favorite color, they do not. And you can see that I've got several cases that execute the same commands. Okay, so if we run this, what is your favorite color? Well, mine is orange. All right, so now let me pick something that's not there. And let's see, turquoise, if I spell it right. Okay, so that went through the default. Okay, so that is basically how case works. I do have another one here too. What department are you in? Based on the department, they get a raise, maybe or maybe not. They have to be in department 10 or 20. If they're in any other department, they are just out of luck. So we could copy and paste, but I think you guys kind of get the idea here. This example is using the department variable, and it's an integer that we're testing. And then we have a default. So when do I use a switch and when do I use a nested if else? So I would use a switch when you are testing one variable, and that variable can have different values, and you are testing for equality. If you need to check, test to see if something is greater than or less than, then you need a nested if else. Okay, so here is a nested if else that should look familiar to you. It is our little menu structure. This is a perfect example of something that could easily be put into a switch. We are testing menu, which is one variable, and we are testing to see if it's equal to these different numbers that they've selected. And if they didn't make a proper selection, we do want to put out an error message. Okay, so here is the structure with the nested if else. Here is the same structure with a switch. Here's an example that can't be switched to a switch, can't be converted to a switch. And the reason is that we are testing more than one thing, and we are not really testing for equality here. So enter your lucky number. We read that in. If it's within this range, we print out a line. If it's not in that range, we're going to test a different range. So this second if is dependent on the first one, and they're both looking at ranges. So this is totally inappropriate for a switch. We would have to keep it as a nested if else. Now, we haven't really talked about break and continue much, but you did see in the switch how we had to use break. Because if we don't use a break in a switch, it just executes all the commands. Break and continue are used to alter the flow of your program. Continue is used in loops. And what continue does is while you're in a loop, there may be a condition that arises where you don't want to execute any more code and you want to go back up to the top of the loop. That is what continue does. So here, this little example, I've got an integer x, and we want to write even numbers only to the console. We do not want to write odd numbers. And we're going to go through this as long as x is less than 8. You can see we add 1 to x, use modulus to see if it's even or odd. And if it's odd, when you try to divide it by 2, we are going to have a remainder. So it will not be equal to 0. So if x modulus 2 doesn't equal 0, we have an odd number. We don't want to print that to the console. So we say continue. What happens then is it skips everything that's below that, and it goes back up to the top of the while loop. So if we play computer here, we've got x equals 0. We add 1, so now x is a 1, right? X modulus 2 doesn't equal 0. That is true, so we do continue. So we go back up here. Now x is a 2. All right. 2 divided by 2 does equal 0, so we write out the number 2. Okay, and then we go back up here. We add 1. Now we got a 3. 3 divided by 2 doesn't equal 0. That's true, so continue. Pop back up here. Now we got a 4. 4 modulus 2 doesn't equal 0. Well, that's false. Okay, there's no remainder. So we go down, we print 4. Okay, so that's how continue works. Break works the same whether you are in a switch or anywhere else. Here I've got we're looking at a counter, and if the counter is greater than 20, we want to break. Okay, so they're only supposed to be entering 20 numbers. And again, they only want to print out numbers that are even. So I don't know why the spacing on this got weird, but let us go into here. So we're going to come through here, enter a number less than 20. I'm going to show you the even values. So we're going to be like typical users here. We're not going to read that. And we will enter the number 50. Okay, well, it only goes to 20. Now, why does it do that? Okay, so we're in this loop. And the while says while counter is less than max. Well, max was 50. Okay, so we add 1 to counter. Here's the reason why it only did 20. If the counter is greater than 20, break. So what does a break do? It gets you out of the structure. You execute the line below. Okay, and why is it only printing our even stuff? Well, that is because of the continue. Okay, so it's looking at the remainder of the division for every single number. And if there is a remainder, if the remainder is not 0, that means it's odd and it goes back up to the top of the loop, which is why we only get our even numbers. Okay, so that is kind of an overview of break and continue. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. The information in this particular chapter was pretty short.